Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, in which we will continue our exploration of the theme of epilepsy. In previous epilepsy-related episodes, we looked at the clinical manifestations and the management of the disease. In this episode, we'll be looking at the intersection of epilepsy with culture and how this affects clinical outcomes. And to explore this theme, I can think of nobody more suited for the task than Anne Fadiman, who joins me today. Anne Fadiman is professor in the practice of creative writing, and she's the Francis Writer in Residence at Yale University. The former editor of The American Scholar and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Fadiman is also the author of two essay collections, Ex Libris and At Large and at Small, and a memoir, The Wine Lover's Daughter. Exciting name. I want to read that. The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, her account of the cross-cultural conflicts between a Hmong family and the American medical system, has won the National Book Critics Circle Award, a Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and a Salon Book Award. Published in 1997, the book has attained classic status within medicine. I think its contents and lessons remain relevant for contemporary medical practice, and that is why I listed it among the important books that this podcast sets out to explore. And Fadiman, welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast, and I'm most grateful that you accepted my invitation.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Good. We'll go straight to my first formulaic question. Why did you write the book?
I wrote the book more or less by accident, or at least I found the topic by accident. And I've always been certain that many of the most important events in any of our lives happen by accident. Very few people, except in arranged marriages, fall in love by anything other than accident. And I was working at a mostly now defunct magazine called Life, but I wanted to write for the New Yorker, and I spent my vacation one year. I was a fairly young journalist at the time. This is all very long ago. Coming up with several ideas for pitches that I thought would be persuasive to the New Yorker. And then at the last minute, I happened to have a phone conversation with an old college friend of mine who was the chief resident in family medicine at a small county hospital in rural California. And he told me that many Hmong refugees from Laos had recently moved to Merced, California, and that their resistance to standard Western medical treatment was causing all kinds of problems. He gave me some examples, and I thought, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. I'll add that idea at the last minute. I knew nothing about the Hmong. And of course, that was the idea that the editor chose. He ended up being fired before my piece ran, so it never ran in the New Yorker, but I ended up doing a book. So it was one of those marvelous accidents that completely changed my life, because I ended up devoting nearly a decade to the project, and my friendship with the family continues to this day and continues to affect how I feel about all kinds of things.
Clearly, you got embedded in their culture. So, did you write the book as part of your post as a journalist, or did you have to sacrifice extra time and do it by the side?
I quit my job at Life when I got the assignment for the New Yorker. And then I finished the piece for the New Yorker, or came close to finishing it, when my editor was fired, not cause and effect. He was replaced by another editor-in-chief at the New Yorker who was mainly interested in celebrities and the idea of devoting tens of thousands of words to an epileptic Hmong toddler who was the protagonist of my story was very far from her list of priorities. So she killed the story, and I was stuck with something that was too long to publish in any other magazine, but too short to be a book. And ultimately, I decided to turn it into a book. So ultimately, I was working full time on the book and spent a lot of time reporting, but mostly spent time researching Hmong history and Hmong culture. The research years were all pre-internet. So we have to realize that talking about this book, it's sort of like trying to decipher the Rosetta Stone. It's so ancient. It's about a medical case that unfolded during the 1980s, and I started reporting it in 1988 and wrote it during the 1990s. So all of this pre-internet, and of course, written at a time when both Hmong culture and medical culture were quite different from the way they are now, particularly Hmong culture, which was far more homogeneous when Hmong refugees first started coming from Laos to the United States.
Within subsequent generations, of course, things change.
Yes.
I refer to you being embedded in their culture. You kind of got into this family, which we'll talk about. And then you also got quite a lot of data, medical data. How did you convince the family to open up, and how did you manage to get the doctors to release documents which didn't entirely show them in the best of lights most of the time?
Well, with the Lees, instantly they wanted to tell me their story because they didn't feel that any Americans, aside from a beloved social worker to whom they were very close, had wanted to understand what had happened from their point of view. The book is about a young Hmong child named Leah Lee, who had a refractory seizure disorder. Her parents were, in the vocabulary of the time, non-compliant in giving her meds. They sometimes didn't give her meds at all or at lower dosages. They felt that the meds were hurting Leah. They didn't understand side effects. I mean, they could see that some of the meds did indeed cause side effects, and the complex tragedy unfolded. And their doctors thought of them as hostile and probably stupid, and they didn't seem either hostile or stupid to me because they didn't view me as an authority figure. They immediately started telling me the story from their point of view because they hoped that it might enable other American doctors to be more sensitive when they had Hmong patients. The motivation of the doctors was entirely altruistic and not so different from the motivation of the Lee family. The primary doctors were a married pair of pediatricians, Dr. Neil Ernst and Dr. Peggy Philp, excellent doctors, Phi Beta Kappa graduates of Berkeley, strong social consciences, wanted to serve the underserved. And they felt that they had made a number of mistakes in the case, that they could have done better. And they wanted other doctors, particularly young ones, to read what had happened so that they could avoid the paths that Neil and Peggy had felt were in error. So they were so altruistic, and that is, I think, quite unusual. Most doctors wouldn't want to open up about a case that had ended in tragedy. But of course, I couldn't do this book now because of, for the most part, very helpful, rather useful for the patient, American regulations on patient privacy that didn't exist at the time. So in order to get access to the voluminous documents that constituted Leah's medical chart and also all of her legal records with the Child Protective Services, all I had to do was tear a little piece of lined paper from my notebook and write, I give Anne Fadiman permission to access all of my daughter Leah Lee's records, and my interpreter Mei Ying Zhang translated it, and Leah's mother, who didn't speak English and couldn't write English but had learned to print in block letters her name, Fua Yang, because she'd had to sign so many pieces of paper that she didn't understand. She did understand this one. Then I took this little piece of paper to the hospital, and they said, okay, we're going to give you the key to the records room. You can't look at the chart and Xerox it during regular hours because we're too busy. But here's the key, and you could, honor system. I think they charged me 5 cents a page. Here's the Xerox machine. And night after night, I did thousands of pages of Leah's chart. I Xeroxed. It goes without saying that wouldn't be possible now. And it also wouldn't be possible for me to construct a narrative from that chart. As a doctor, that digital charts, although there's some text, there's a lot of checking of boxes. And many of the notes written by the doctors and nurses were in handwriting. You could tell when people were angry. It was a narrative. When I started the book, I had no idea I would quote so much from Leah's chart, but it ended up being an important counter narrative that enabled the reader to see that the whole attitude and the language, the sort of sterile language, occasionally with emotion breaking through, of Leah's doctors and nurses was entirely different from the perspective of the Lees themselves. So I just got in under the wire. I am so grateful that I was able to do the book when I did, although it probably would have taken fewer years if the internet had existed when I began my research.
It may have, but it would have lost, I think, quite a lot of makes the book attractive. So you referred to Leah, who is kind of at the center of the book, 14th child of her parents. And her illness started at 3 months and kind of a variety of symptoms. She was rolling her eyes, jerking her head, episode of fainting. And what intrigued me was the parents thought these symptoms were because Leah's older sister, had slammed the door, and that noise had taken Leah's soul away. Is that kind of their concept of how?
Yes, that's the title of the book. The spirit catches you and you fall down, as a literal translation of Cao Da Pei, which is the Hmong phrase for epilepsy. And they indeed believed that Leah's older sister Yer had scared her soul out of her body, and they needed to entice that soul back. Interestingly, later on, they believed that what was making Leah sick was her meds. She ultimately had a profound neurological crisis that we'll probably talk about in the course of this conversation, and they believed that it was caused by Leah's meds. At some point, their spiritual explanation morphed into what you might call a medical explanation, but was really an anti-medical explanation. This sort of explanation for illness was quite common among traditional Hmong animists, and many of my Hmong friends, even those who have allegedly converted to Christianity, are still animists. They have a sort of both and spiritual practice, and still use herbal supplements, still use amulets, sometimes still sacrifice animals. Often you will see Hmong children still with strings around their wrists, spirit strings to keep the spirit inside. So there's, of course, much wider diversity in beliefs and practices among Hmong today. Again, this story was unfolding during the 1980s. So Hmong refugees fleeing after the Vietnam War had quite recently started to come to the United States, and still had almost exclusively quite traditional beliefs that certainly not all Hmong still hold.
Well, you did show how the beliefs were changing with the younger generations. And again, that another Hmong view of epilepsy, which caught my attention, was that they considered somebody with epilepsy to be a person of consequence. And that person has the power, I'm quoting it, the power to perceive things other people cannot see. and they tended to be shamans within the community. Is that a bit unusual compared to other cultures where people with epilepsy are kind of historically been seen as people who are possessed by the
Mhm.
devil?
Well, certainly during the Christian Middle Ages, definitely people who had seizure disorders were viewed as um, possessed by demons. And the treatments, well, some of them were quite cruel, but some of them were, you might say, spiritual, the Middle Ages equivalent of what the Lees were doing, prayer and fasting and lighting candles and so on. But the Hmong culture is certainly not the only one in which there is some spiritual distinction to epilepsy. Shamanic cultures all over the world often have seen seizures as a sort of entry point into a realm of consciousness that the rest of us don't have access to. And that's true with some individuals. Dostoevsky, as you know, as a neurologist, I'm sure, he had a seizure disorder, and he viewed his seizures, particularly the aura preceding them, as the most ecstatic points in his life. He had a sort of oceanic feeling of oneness with the universe. Everything seemed beautiful and harmonious. That's certainly not true for everyone with seizure disorders, but it was for him. And he made one of his most important characters, Prince Mishkin, who's the hero of The Idiot, an epileptic who had the same view of epilepsy as Dostoevsky did. And Prince Mishkin is viewed as an idiot by others, but is viewed by the author and reader as a very wise man. One could maybe feel that if he'd been Hmong, he would have become a shaman. So there is, I would say there's more stigma in Hmong culture surrounding epilepsy now than there was at that time. And but at least at that time, it was Leah's parents understood that the seizures were an illness and that they made her uncomfortable. And that they were a problem, but they also hoped that she would end up as a shaman. Not that all epileptics became shamans, but it was viewed as one way of becoming a shaman, and that would have been a very distinguished role in her culture.
And I guess that explained their view. Again, quoting you, that's her parents viewed her seizures with a mixture of concern and pride. So she had epilepsy, but they were concerned about this. I guess the severity of her epilepsy. Was that unique? Was it just bad luck? She kind of progressed to developing grand mal seizures, and then status epilepticus. And was it just bad luck?
Well, of course, to the Hmong, nothing is bad luck. Everything has a spiritual cause, except in this case, of course, they felt that some of Leah's problems were caused by her doctors. It's hard to say. She was given at one point a tentative diagnosis of Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which, as you know, is a very refractory seizure disorder, often with bad outcomes. It's hard to treat. There probably are better treatments for it now. But again, this was unfolding in the 80s. But that was never confirmed because she ended up having a neurological crisis that, among other things, made her stop having seizures. So it may have been Lennox-Gastaut, it may have been something else. The Lees usually took her to the hospital when the seizures did not stop. So when status epilepticus would begin and they would just see her seizing and seizing and seizing, they lived 3 blocks from the county hospital in Merced, California, and her father, now Cow, would sling her on his back and run to the hospital. Despite their feeling that seizures were distinguished in some way and that Leah was a sort of royal princess in some way because of her seizures, it was terribly frightening to them when the seizures did not stop. And those were generally the times when they would take her to the hospital.
And that's quite a lot, wasn't it? I think about 17 admissions, so many outpatient appointments. And that surprised me, despite the lack of communication between the two sides. They were still hopeful that the hospital system can help Leah. What was it that they had no other option but to go there?
Well, it's not that they had no other option. They were also doing a very sort of complex set of traditional healing practices, including animal sacrifices, including amulets. Her mother, Fua, grew herbs in her backyard. There was coining, rubbing coins along Leah's body. They were doing all kinds of things, but they had had a quite good experience with Western medicine when their family was in a refugee camp in Thailand after a very harrowing and traumatic experience fleeing from Laos on foot at the end of the Vietnam War. Um, and several of their children had gotten very ill, and one of them had died, and they had brought the other three into the clinic doctor, and one of them ended up being hospitalized. And the other three all survived. We don't know what the matter was, but because the three of them got better so quickly when they were treated, her doctors later on assumed that this must have been some kind of infection that could be treated with antibiotics. So they'd seen Western medicine work. The Hmong in Merced tended to be quite suspicious of Western medicine, and many Hmong patients were very deeply frustrating to their doctors because they didn't want blood taken, they didn't want spinal taps, they didn't want episiotomies during childbirth after somebody died. They didn't want autopsies, and so their rejection of many very standard treatments made them difficult, and the Lees simultaneously subscribed to this general suspicion of doctors, but also knew that when Leah was having seizures that would not stop. As a neurologist, you've seen status epilepticus. I never have. I first met Leah when she was already in a vegetative state. But you know how frightening it would be for parents. They knew that this was not good. This was not a minor seizure episode that would last a couple of minutes and then she would be fine. And so generally when they would bring her in, the doctors in the ER would be able to give her anticonvulsants, and as her mother told me later, and then a few days later, Leah would be running around and she was fine. So they were suspicious of the kind of daily regimen of meds, but they felt that when something really bad happened, that the doctors did in fact know how to fix it. I should say that the doctors had absolutely no idea that the Lees simultaneously were pursuing these traditional healing paths, and they would have been extremely surprised to hear what they were, and indeed were surprised to hear what they were later on when I told them.
Interesting. And I mean, clearly the cultural differences played a part, but the other one was this communication language barrier. And I was surprised to learn that there was no budget for interpreters, despite the large number of Hmong refugees in the area. And apart from that, they were using janitors to translate.
Yeah, Hmong janitor. And they also often used the oldest Lee child who was still living at home, May Lee, who during a lot of this was around 12. And of course, it's highly inappropriate to use a child, a family member, to interpret, especially in an emergency. But this is very common in those days. It was before medical interpreting was legally mandated, and this was a small county hospital with perennially short of funds. And until it was required, starting in 2000 and then a bit later, by some wider mandating that any healthcare provider who received federal funds had to have certified interpreting. But of course, it was before the digital revolution allowed for remote interpreting, which isn't as good, but is very commonly used throughout the United States, I'm sure in Britain as well, particularly for less common languages such as Hmong. But none of that existed. So before it was legally required, the hospital simply didn't spend money on it, which meant that much of the interpreting that went on, if any of it went on, was either by someone inappropriate, such as a child who had learned English in American schools, or somebody like the janitor. And I did find that shocking, but the more time I spent at the hospital, the more I understood that there simply wasn't money in the budget for this completely surprising influx of people who seemed inexplicable and enigmatic. The other large non-English speaking group in Merced was Spanish speaking, because Merced is in the middle of the agricultural belt in the Central Valley of California. And many of the doctors and nurses spoke Spanish, or at least a little Spanish. And there was always someone around who spoke good Spanish, who would be able to interpret. And then the Hmong came. Who spoke Hmong? Nobody.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of them until I read your book. I have to confess my ignorance.
I should maybe explain who they are.
Yes,
They
please.
were a hill tribe in Laos, originally in China, and because of various violent and discriminatory experiences in China, a big group of Hmong relocated to the hills of Laos, mostly in the early 19th century, and were able to maintain their traditional lifestyles because they were the highest on the mountain. So nobody was sort of walking through and bringing a whole lot of lowland culture in their direction. So they continued to speak their own language, Hmong, rather than Lao. And they were more or less dragooned into the Vietnam War by my country, which was permitted by the Geneva Accords to send its own troops into Vietnam, but not to Laos, which was considered very militarily important. Laos was next door. So the Hmong were dragooned and paid vastly less than American privates and had much higher casualty rates. And then when Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia all fell to the communist sides in 1975, Americans left, and the Hmong were the targets of genocide, and tens of thousands of them fled on foot to Thailand, and many of them ultimately ended up in the United States.
Yeah, we can see echoes of that, I think, in recent history as well.
Yes. America's foreign policy. I mean, there's much I love about my country, but that's not always one of those things.
Not the highest point of it, I suppose. So getting back to their interaction, the family with Leah's doctors, there are the medical issues, which quite complex, obviously. But then the social aspect, the social workers came in, and I thought the lowest point was when Leah was taken away from her parents and put into foster care twice. Was that kind of extreme, or what led to that?
Well, Leah's doctor didn't know what else to do. I think there were some things that they could have done, but they felt they'd tried everything in the arsenal that they had been taught in medical school. And they felt that Leah's seizures were getting worse and worse. They feared that something terrible would happen to her, which eventually it did. And felt that the most important thing was getting Leah her meds as prescribed, and that the Lees were not doing that. And so the only way to do that was to get a court order. This had to be done through the American legal system to get Leah removed from her family and sent to a foster family that would give her her meds as prescribed. And here we have a moment in the story that just, it never fails to surprise me. You would expect that the Lees would have hated that foster family. but they loved the foster family. The foster family had a daughter who was about the age of May again being the oldest child living at home. Uh, and they became very good friends. And what was particularly remarkable is that the foster mom uh, felt that the Lees were excellent parents in every way except giving the meds as prescribed. And sometimes she had a baby of her own. And sometimes when she would take Leah to a medical appointment, she would ask Fua, Leah's mom, who had been legally declared negligent by the American court system, to babysit her baby. This is the relationship between those two families. Just it's absolutely remarkable. So Leah was in foster care for close to a year, and her foster family did indeed give her meds as prescribed, but because it was such a enigmatic and difficult seizure disorder, even though they went to a neurologist and so on, they went beyond Merced. Her seizure disorder didn't improve, but all the while, a social worker whom the Lees liked was trying to teach them how to give her meds. And one of the meds was changed from pills that Leah would spit out to liquid depkine that she liked the taste of. It was easier to get it in her. And the Lees seemed ready to take over and were willing to give her meds as prescribed. So she was finally sent home. This was all unfolding. By the way, all of this was basically sort of from 0 to 4. So we're talking about a very young child here.
Very active child, obviously, when she was well.
Yes.
And then the big one happened, which kind of left her brain dead, but paradoxically cured her of her epilepsy.
God, the big one. Yeah, that was what her doctors called it. Her main doctor, well, her main two doctors, Neil Ernst and Peggy Phil. Neil had been really afraid that he would be the one on call when the big one happened, and he was. And Leah was brought in, this time by ambulance, because Now Cow thought that the hospital would pay more attention to her if she were brought by ambulance. And so a ton of time was wasted with the ambulance. The ambulance, the EMT, spent almost 20 minutes at the Leah's house failing to get an IV, to get an anticonvulsant in her. If Now Cow had just slung Leah on his back and run 3 blocks as he usually did, who knows what might have happened, but he didn't. So she's brought in by ambulance, and the residents couldn't get in an IV. She was overweight, and also like a heroin addict, all of her entry points, her veins were so overused and damaged from previous IVs. Neil was called in the middle of the night. Eventually, they did get an IV in, and she was moved to pediatric intensive care unit in a nearby city. That county hospital didn't have one, but there were many misunderstandings along the way. It was the night before Thanksgiving, and Neil and Peggy and their families were about to go away to spend a few days over Thanksgiving at their cabin near the Sierra Mountains. And Neil explained that Leah was being moved to a more advanced facility and that he would be away for a few days, but then he would be back. And Leah's family thought, well, Neil and Peggy, they're the doctors who've been able to fix Leah in the past when she wouldn't stop seizing, but they're sending her to another hospital because they're going on vacation. So complete misunderstanding there. And she eventually stopped seizing, but then it turned out that her main problem was septic shock. In Merced, unaccountably, nobody had thought to take her temperature and found out that to find out whether she had a fever. They just sort of thought, oh, this is just what always happens with Leah, but worse. The bottom line was that she ended up in a vegetative state and never regained her brain function, but she didn't die, even though all the doctors predicted that she would. But this was a terrible tragedy for the family. Her mother once said that this was worse than the loss of her children. Some of her children had died in Laos and during their fleeing from Laos to Thailand. And it was because she knew other families who had had those tragedies happen, but this was something that where there's absolutely no commonality in her community. Leah was the only child she knew to whom this awful thing had happened. And so it affected her even more than the horrendous tragedies that had befallen the family during and after the Vietnam War.
And the way the family looked after Leah, even though she was effectively brain dead, was so touching. It's the dedication I couldn't imagine. What was that because of Leah's specific circumstances, or would they have done it anyway if they had a child who was disabled, for instance?
I think they would have been great parents to any child. They're really wonderful parents. There were wonderful parents. Both Phua and Nao Kao have died. But Leah was always special. I always felt Leah was the most loved. And I met Leah about a year after this neurological crisis. And the loving care that everybody gave her, but especially her mother, was just so moving to watch. She was a full person to them always. And she lived to the age of 30. So let's now just digest this. You know, as a doctor, how extremely difficult it is to take care of a patient in a vegetative state. They're almost always institutionalized, and they usually die quite quickly. They kept her alive for 26 years at home. And so paradoxically, then all of a sudden, the doctors and nurses at their local hospital started thinking of them as great parents. Leah didn't have seizures anymore. She didn't have to take any meds. That had been the only sticking point. And they could see year after year when Leah would come in for checkups, she was beautifully clean. She was just so well taken care of. And so then the image of the Lee parents changed from these maddening, stubborn, negligent, non-compliant parents to these amazing saints and angels who were miraculously keeping this child alive.
It's interesting. There's a lot to delve into that. But let's come to you. I mean, we use the word embedded. I think that's the best I can find. What did you learn as an individual from your engagement with the Lees personally?
Oh, I learned a lot. I wasn't married at the time, but I wasn't married when I first met the Lees, but my now husband, proposed very soon after he visited Merced, and I was in my mid-30s at the time. Phua dressed me as a Hmong bride in order to render me irresistible to George, because she felt that I was much too old not to be married, and I needed to get married quickly and start having kids. And so that obviously worked. George proposed. But I didn't have children at the time, and I was very much influenced in the way I raised my children by watching Phua with her children. I breastfed my children, carried them around. I would use a snuggly, not a Hmong baby carrier, which goes on the back, but much longer than American parents usually would. I just felt that Phua taught me how to be a good mom. And I was also very impressed by the role of elders in Hmong culture. There was often in Hmong homes that I would visit, and grandparent or great grandparent, even in the corner. In my culture, people live so far from their parents and their grandparents, and the grandparents have no part in the raising of their children, and it's viewed as the older somebody gets, the more irrelevant their views are, instead of being viewed as someone who might have some wisdom. And so I wanted to make sure that our children spend as much time as possible with both sets of grandparents. But maybe the most important thing was that I'm a very rational thinker. I still am. I didn't become spiritual. I didn't start taking my children to a Hmong shaman when they were ill. I remained the person I'd always been. But I could see that the rational problem solving mode wasn't the only way and sometimes wasn't the best way. I saw it fail in this instance because the doctors did not understand the Lee's explanatory models. They didn't know anything about how the Lees were doing things. And also, if Leah had been institutionalized, she would have died at a much earlier age. Everybody agrees on this. So my culture's way of doing things, particularly rational problem solving, I had to concede was not always the best path. And that was a real revelation that caused the sort of a revolution in humility for me.
That's this big learning point from there. And after all this time, I mean, what do you think is the main reason why your book is still taught in American medical schools? I mean, it's been 27 years. It is still valuable. Why do you think that is?
Well, of course, some parts of it are obsolete, but cross-cultural misunderstanding, alas, lives on, especially in my country, which has so many waves of refugees, although I've spent time living in London, and there's really no more multicultural city in the world than London. But the problems continue. So whether or not doctors ever have a Hmong patient, doctors today, I think, see that some of the difficulties in this case are continuing to come up. Some of these problems were unique to Hmong culture, but many of them, I think, are not unique. They simply have to do with the way that the healthcare system has traditionally dealt with patients from other cultures, i.e., not very well. So I wish that healthcare cross-culturally had changed and improved so much that my book would seem completely irrelevant. The fact that it's still read shows how many problems there still are.
I suspect, I mean, the world is much smaller, so you could argue the problem is actually bigger, isn't it? The people.
Very, very possibly.
Are you still in touch with the Lee family, and what has happened to Leah since then?
Leah died in 2012, and she died of aspiration pneumonia. She was 30, and she had a very beautiful 3-day funeral, which, of course, I attended. I've continued to be very close to her family. Before her mother, Fua, died of COVID very sadly in 2021. I viewed Fua as a kind of surrogate mother. I'd lost my own mother, all my aunts, my mothers had died long ago. And boy, when I would visit and Fua would give me a hug, nobody could give a hug like Fua. She was just motherhood incarnate. And I've continued to keep in close touch with Leah's siblings. In fact, last summer, we had a 3-day visit from 9 members of her family. 3 of her sisters and 5 of their daughters came out to Massachusetts to see us. And they were just the most fun, wonderful guests. So I continue to feel a part of that family and feel that they are part of my family. And I hope that that is the case for the rest of my life.
It obviously wasn't just a book. It's a life, isn't it?
It's a life. It was a life experience that definitely did not end with the publication of the book. The Lees are very, very, very important to me.
Well, we're coming
In
to.
fact, here, I'm going to stand up for a moment because I'll get down above my desk. I have a photograph of Fua and Leah dressed in traditional Hmong clothes that I look at every day.
Okay, let's have a look at it. Oh, yeah, that's
So,
the picture on the cover of the book, isn't it?
yes, but a very important part is missing, which
Yes.
is, Leah's mother. So I look at that
Yeah.
picture every day. It's up there with photographs of my own family.
Well, very touching, very touching. I mean, we've talked about so many lessons of the book, but what would you say is the most important?
I think that it has to do with how we look at encounters between two people of different cultures. And if an encounter turns out badly, of course, it's possible that one or both sides might have ill intentions. One or both sides might be acting from racist impulses. Language could, of course, be part of it. But in my view, the largest, most likely reason that that encounter went wrong is that neither side can see the other's point of view. And just attempting to see how the other side perceives reality, that doctors who were so well educated and would definitely, if I had lived in Merced when I had small kids, they would have definitely been my children's pediatricians. I have so much respect for them, but they never asked a single question about what the Lees were doing for their daughter's illness, about what the Lees thought had caused their daughter's illness, about what the Lees were most afraid of in their daughter's illness. Not one, because they hadn't been taught to in medical school. Now, medical schools are getting much better at cross-cultural education. But I think the central lesson is try to see the other side's point of view. And if the Lees had seen the doctor's good intentions, they, I think, would have been much more likely to trust them and trust their med prescriptions. I think ultimately they respected the doctors, and ultimately the doctors respected the Lees, but it was too late. Leah had already had her neurological crisis was in a vegetative state. So the central lesson is see the other person's point of view and don't assume that your perception of reality is the only one around.
Well, Leah has taught the world a lesson in that way. Anne Fadiman, thank you very much for participating in this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. I'm most grateful indeed. I've learned more than just what I thought I would. To my audience, thank you very much for listening or watching the podcast. If you found it enlightening, you may consider subscribing to my database called Neuro Checklist, or buy my book, which is far down the ladder to Anne's. My book is called Surfing the Brain. There's a few anecdotes in there. And if you want to catch the next episode of the podcast, you might want to also subscribe either to the Apple, the Spotify or YouTube channels of the podcast. Do join me then. And Anne Fadiman, thank you very, very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Imam. These were marvelous questions, and I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Very much. I'll probably bring you back and discuss another of your other books. Thank you very much.